Welcome back to the podcast. I'm Kate.
And I'm Anna. And this week I spoke with Anne Pieckielon, and I haven't necessarily pronounced that right, but Anne does speak about it in the podcast, a little bit about the origin of her last name and kind of what that means to her, which I quite liked because I did try, but she can explain it a lot better than me. But Anne is currently on the payment systems regulator panel, and she represents consumer interests. So a lot of what she's working on is representing the consumer side in terms of payments and how payments are meeting customer needs. And Anne has also led strategy and product development at Bax, which is now pay.uk. And she's also passionate about financial inclusion and diversity efforts, and also challenging traditional payment models. So things that we spoke about were a lot of Anne's career milestones, because she's had quite a diverse career working in banking, payments, doing charity work, and leading consumer advocacy efforts. So we spoke a lot about her career journey from, her first role in a high street bank and kind of where she went from there, which was really, I think, it was fun to talk about just that journey that she's gone on and some of her reflections throughout that process. And she also led the current account switch service, which people in the UK will have heard of that, which is basically, she'll talk more in detail about how it works and where it came from, but it basically helps customers switch accounts without, too much paperwork, or just really streamlining that process. So if a customer finds a bank that better suits their needs, you can switch a lot easier than in the past. So she talks about the origin of that and the work she did in leading that switching service. And then something else we discussed was one of my favorite questions around the role of cash and the likelihood of a cashless future, because this always leads to some great conversation about inclusion and digital technology and digital inclusion, and also just a bit of context on the payment space and banking channels, and particularly in the UK context, how digital is growing and, the role that cash plays for particular people in the community. So a lot of different things that we spoke about, but it was a really great chat with someone who just has so much experience in this payments and diversity and inclusion sector.
That cash point is just so topical at the moment as well. And we could talk for hours, I think, about all the RFI data that we have around changing payment methods and the decline of cash, and how the pandemic has really sped up that decline of cash. And we're now starting to see, a few years ago, there'd be merchants who are only cash accepting, and now we're starting to see it go the other way, and merchants who won't accept cash at all. And it does raise interesting questions around financial inclusion and whether you're forcing customers to use a payment method maybe they're less comfortable with. I was also reflecting as you're talking on, I did a presentation the other week talking about check usage, which we haven't really covered in a lot of detail at least in the Australian market in quite a while, but it's one of those things that comes up every now and then around, do consumers still need checks? What purpose do they solve for? Is there a way to migrate customers away from checks? I think similar to where we'll probably end up with cash, there is a segment of society who just are happy using what they've always used, and you don't really want to force them to use something else. So you kind of do have to continue to support these traditional payment methods for an increasingly small proportion of the market.
I love the check topic as well, because I remember we were discussing that internally, where I kind of asked our team, or I think I just spoke to a few people in the business around, do you still use checks? Because in my head I was sure no one's using them, and there were, checks just weren't a thing anymore. And then everyone was giving me specific examples of how they've had to pay their rent with a check. They had to, they had a check from when they had money left over on an account. And there was all these examples that I honestly hadn't thought of. And I think cash has a similar experience where customers, some people just think, well, I don't use cash. I haven't used cash in 5 years. So who else is using it? And it's really interesting to step back and actually think, here are the key roles that, cash plays. And, 5-10 years ago, we were having similar conversations with checks, where that was just a standard, method of paying, travelers checks, getting paid your salary or getting your wage with a check. And it's just interesting, thinking about how these payment methods change. And then something like the pandemic that just throws a spanner in the works and really changes how people are paying and what they expect, and the role of those different payment methods as well.
Also, what happens if your technology fails? I'm one of those people who uses Apple Pay for everything, and I've been stuck in a couple of instances where someone's POS machine's gone down, and what do you do then? Because you can't access cash all that easily with your phone. So there are access concerns just around payment methods as well, around cash. Sounds like a really interesting conversation. Looking forward to hearing it.
thank you for joining us for this week's episode of the RFI Group Digital Banker podcast. And with me today is Anne Pieckielon, who is a leader in the payment space, having led strategy and product development at Bax, which was formerly which is now Pay.uk, challenging traditional payment models and championing financial inclusion and diversity. Anne is also currently on the Payment Systems Regulator panel representing consumer interests, and we'll go into it a little bit more about this throughout the discussion. But to start off with, Anne, could you introduce yourself to our listeners a little bit more in detail and talk us through some of your key career milestones?
Certainly will. And just like to say thank you very much for inviting me to have this discussion with you this morning. It's a lovely sunny day here. It's so let's have a nice bright and breezy discussion. So my name's Anne Pieckielon, is the name that most people get a bit jumped up about. And I've realised actually with my second name, actually it's good to be different in some cases, because it actually makes me stand out from the crowd. So if I think about my career as a looking back, and really I have to think about what I would say to my 15-year-old self when I started my career, was actually to be bold. I started my career doing a Saturday job in a high street bank, and it was the cooperative bank, and I didn't know what I was going to do. I still didn't know many years later, but the bank really gave me a good standing in my ability to think about what I wanted to do in the future. So I did a vast number of jobs. I was a cashier, I was the back office person, I made the tea, but then I progressed and I was able to do strategy, and also I learned all about budgeting from a personal perspective, but also from a company perspective. I ended my career really as a highlight, primarily working with charities. We did a lot of things to think about what we had as a bank, which is back office functions, which is around processing payments. And we took that information out to the charities and we developed what we called a locked box system. And it's quite a good concept now, because what it is actually it enables charities to provide a central address for people to make donations to. And we used to have a room of people that were opening up envelopes and finding out what we did. And then we progressed that to the Disasters Emergency Committee. So I actually find that, or hold that up as one of my main contributors to the charity sector. And it was something I loved doing, because I worked with a range of charities, from cancer charities also to dog charities and old age, like age concern. And it gave me a big insight as to what the world, there were many different needs across different products. So I went from there to Bax Payment Schemes, and at the time I was head of schemes. Didn't really know what the actual job was, because head of schemes, what's that about? I went for the job because actually someone recommended, it was my boss at the time, didn't want to get rid of me. He made a point of saying that. But he said, actually, Anne, you need to develop, and this is a good way for you to develop. Because my 15-year-old self, or myself at that time, I was very much, I'd only ever been for that one job. So this is my proper first interview for an alternative career. So I spent a lot of time at Bax, and during that time we changed the process. So what does it mean? It was working for the central infrastructure. So we had a really privileged position whereby actually what we did impacted the whole ecosystem. So from consumers out on the street to actually large corporates and also regulators and the government. So I'm able to actually have that ability to speak to all of those communities, but it really gave us the actual, we had to make sure that whatever we did within the centre, any changes that we did in the centre, were actually, we understood what it meant to the whole ecosystem. I always put it back to that game of whack-a-mole. So, you make a change at this end of the system, and actually what happens, something pops up here and you didn't realise the consequences of what you were doing. So what I learned from that, and I take away from that, is actually before you make change or product innovation or anything along those lines, you have to ensure that you've actually completed your research properly. I even took assumptions as to what changes were required and what people wanted. But actually, when you go out and talk to people, you're quite often surprised actually what they require or come back to you with. And that was very relevant when we did the current account switch service. So just finishing off on my career there. So I worked my way through on back payment schemes. It wasn't a large company. We started at 9, but when I left, it was about 60 odd. But we had a big influence. I mean, we were processing trillions of value of transactions and millions of transactions a day. But my role transitioned into director of product and strategy. And I think the reason I did that is because it was all around actually ensure I'm absolutely passionate about ensuring that end users are catered for and looked after. That's any end users, that could be even the corporates that are using a service. But also it's around reuse. You know, if you've got a system, is there any way that you can use it in a different way? And also look at actually not just doing tomorrow what you've done today, it's by actually questioning and challenging how you do that. So I ended my career at Bax when it was amalgamated with Fast Payments and Check and Credit Clearing as Pay.UK, because I thought it was the right time to move on. Since then, I'm now doing some work for the Bank of England around the transition into the new standards around ISO 20022, which is really interesting. And obviously, I'm working as consumer advocate for the payment system regulator, and I do some other projects as well.
What a great rundown of your career. And I think there's, I mean, obviously so much that you've done, even from the very beginning. I think it's interesting thinking about the journey into financial services. It seems that a lot of us start without the intention of necessarily being so passionate about financial services and inclusion and payments, but it just naturally develops in that way. And I think your work with charities and then, you know, payments and thinking about strategy as well, I think it's clear how much kind of work has gone into a lot of these decisions that have, decisions that have been made and projects that you've worked on. And I think the big topic to be talking about today is about your work on the current account switch service. So potentially for those listeners who don't know what this is, for people who are outside of the UK or aren't really across what this means and how this benefits consumers, could you talk us through what that involves and how this really does help consumers with their banking and with, you know, even competition in the market?
I'm really proud about my role within CAS. Call it CAS because as with anything within payments, we always have to abbreviate everything. So so we went to current account switch service. So if we think about we're payments, why would we get involved with a product that actually was our members were actually providing to their customers? And the reason being is because actually the current account switch service is really a messaging service. So we go back, we knew that there was an issue. So that people were actually asking for accounts to be switched from one institution to another. But actually it was getting lost in the system. It was taking weeks, not days. And people were getting frustrated and there was no proper process behind it. That became even more prevalent when you actually got then to secondary agency banks, so building societies, because letters would get lost in the big scheme of things. And so the competition across even the market was actually being impacted because those smaller agencies never actually got a voice at the table as to trying to make change. So that we knew there was an issue. First thing we did is we actually went out to see some of our members. And if I give you a visual, I went into one particular member's current account department, and there are piles of paper like this. Literally, people were sitting with papers around them. You think this is a fire risk. But you think each piece of paper is someone's issue. You know, someone is saying, what's going on? You know, and this is my money. This is deep within me. If this goes missing, what happens? We also knew there was an even bigger issue, and I'll talk about the cash ISA transfer service, which you may not have even heard of. And this was within the UK, we have a product that you're able to save into, And then most people look around just before the tax year in April to say that they want to transfer. And again, everyone wants to do it within a period of time. So the members were having to get multiple people into these rooms to try and get these switches actually completed within time. And they were getting frustrated because it was costing them a lot of money. It was costing the customers a lot of money because they were losing on better interest rates. And then the members themselves were getting fined. So the regulators were also getting involved in this. So we took the cash ISA service. We, as BACS, usually as a payment system, we actually bid to build the service. And it's about 1 million transactions per annum, 90% of which, as I said, took place in 1 month. So we just looked at we went out and said to customers, what is it that you want? What do you want to do, what to happen? And they said, actually, all we want to do is make sure that our money gets transferred. We know what's happening. And we know that if there's something goes wrong, who to go to. So it's very simple. So we built the service, and that was then all the lessons learned that we've had from that. We then looked from the current account perspective. We also did a shed load of more research because our assumptions at the time were actually people want to transfer their direct debits and their standing orders to their new account, and it's actually time critical. They wanted to do it from A to B. They want to do it in a particular way. But when we talked to people, the same principles came out. What they wanted from a central infrastructure, this is the customers, was actually something that they could trust, and they knew what was happening, and they knew who to speak to again if something went wrong. They didn't want to talk to the old bank. In some cases, they'd actually fallen out with their old bank, but they just wanted one point of contact. So it was the terms that were coming out were seamless, stress-free, and actually understanding what was happening. So we built the service based on that. And people say, well, why does it take 7 days? Actually, there is a requirement because that enables you to capture all of those direct debits in flight, or your bill payments in flight, enable you to actually have a set time at which the transfers were made. So the current account switch service, from a payments perspective, actually, it wasn't around it's around the payment mandates, the count transactions, and understanding who would be responsible for actually transitioning those accounts from A to B. So my role within that was as advocate to begin with, to actually understand and put this product in, to argue that actually a payment scheme should get involved in a current account system. And the reason being is because you had that secure network. But my main role was around governance, because my principle was actually the payment schemes prior to that were very much driven by the larger members, and the smaller members didn't actually have the ability to have a voice at the table. So the governance that we did, and I think, so the first thing was we actually understood what product was that we wanted, the end users wanted, rather than us building something that we thought they wanted. We then actually put in the governance to say that when it was in live, that even smaller institutions would have a very, very smooth route into actually coming on board, because it was good for the larger institutions as well, because they wanted to ensure they got rid of the paper. And the more we could encourage those smaller institutions to come on board, the better. But they also had a role going forward, in as much as we set up a governance committee that said, this is what we want to do. And we also said that once a year, we'd have a strategy forum in which we would then ensure that what we had actually was still fit for purpose. So you don't just because it's successful doesn't mean to say that you can't then actually make changes. Then the other thing I was really, really keen on is we worked very closely with government to find out, because this is around what does success look like. So when we're looking at our criteria, it's easy to say success for a central service should be the number of transactions that go through it. Wrong. Because, and someone explained this to me, and another picture for you in your mind is that you can build the best plane in the world to go from here to Australia so we can see each other in person. However, if I don't want to go to Australia, it might be the best plane. I'm not going to get on there. So as a central infrastructure, I could build the best product in the world, but it wasn't down to me to encourage people to actually get on the plane. So we argued and we went to Treasury and said, look, so let's go back to the principles of why we were building this. The principles is that people want to trust this service, and they want to actually ensure that if something goes wrong, that they know who to go to. So therefore, we agreed a success criteria of 75% awareness. So our main criteria was actually to ensure that people knew the service was there and that they would be protected, rather than actually promoting the service itself. So you may see our Mr. Switch guy in some of our adverts, if you've been in the UK, but that was, I think, a change in government thinking. And I think if you then bring that as a lesson learned to today with open banking, you would then start to think, actually, to ensure that open banking is actually a success, what we should be doing is actually understanding what it's trying to achieve. And I know there are multiple products, but this is actually building consumer confidence, because we spent so many years telling them not to give away any of their data, so that we can actually start to open those doors. So the current account switch service, very much working with the regulator, and it was part of the principles that actually started open banking, the road to open banking. So hopefully that's good, some learnings you get from that.
Absolutely. And I think the analogy of the plane, or just the concept that even if the solution is amazing, if people don't use it, then it just sits there. The plane there's no passengers, and for what? So I like the idea of kind of reimagining or redefining what that success criteria is, and actually having it being just awareness that there's a better way of actually switching, or even that there's solutions in place so that you don't send off your paper form and have it literally sit there. I'm picturing this desk with a pile of paper, which I think is just such a clear image of what's taking so long when switching used to be really painful and time consuming. And just that image of the paperwork, I think, really speaks to how these solutions can be so helpful.
And we went out following that. Following that, we went to the energy sector and told them what we did and how we did it. So they took lessons learned, and also water board, etc. So I think if you're looking at the payments world, is around collaboration. It's around entities working together and ensuring that because there's a winner and a loser in all of this. So working together, you can actually then come out with a better product at the end of it.
I think it also speaks to the point that you made a little bit earlier about the fact that in an ecosystem, if you make one solution, you have to think about who else it could be impacting, or even unintended consequences, or you make a solution for this group, but who's excluded. And it seems that a lot of these decisions, I'm sure there was some pretty intense conversations that went on behind the scenes to make sure that these solutions are appropriate and accessible, and really meet the needs of what was clearly quite a clear need in the market as well.
Absolutely.
Are there any stats that you have on how many people have successfully switched using the service? Are there those kinds of stats around, people switching?
I should do it, because that's the other thing that we did actually. I think it's, I won't give you a number because I haven't looked recently. Mm-hmm. And I then urge people to go to the BACS website for the current account switch service, because one of the other things that we did is working with the regulators. Is the other thing that we could do is actually track how many people were satisfied with their switch, because whilst we can't make them get on the plane, we can actually ask them once they've been on the plane actually how the journey was. And the other thing we asked the members to do is actually to publish the data of how many accounts that they've won and lost on a regular basis. So people can go to the BACS website now and actually get that data, and it's published a quarter in arrears, and they will show you the winners and losers, and they show also how many people have been satisfied with the service. And I'm so proud to say, actually, it's always in the high 90s that people were absolutely satisfied. And that comes out to the principle of having one point of contact if something goes wrong. Now, I don't know if I get on the phone and try and find out, if something, my Amazon parcel hasn't arrived or something. And the frustrations I experience are extremely, I hit the roof sometimes as I'm getting older as well. But it was we actually worked with the members and said it has to be really clear, because it's the winning bank who wants to engage with that customer that actually has that full responsibility.
And you mentioned trust as well being important. Consumers want the information, the fact that they can go on the website and actually see this is the proportion, this is the number who's successfully switching, this is who banks are losing these customers, they're gaining these customers. It's been quite a good way to encourage customer trust as well, because it's not a secret. It's not, oh, we're losing these customers, what are we going to do to get them back? It's here's the numbers, and it's quite accessible, which I think especially in recent years, trust is becoming more and more important. The research that we have shows that. I know other research shows that as well. And especially with banking, it's our money, and we want to know that what we're doing is the right thing. And we also want the ability to access the information to make these decisions as well. So I think it's such a great initiative, and really encourages that kind of culture of transparency as well.
And especially in the UK, I'm not sure how it is in Australia, but we have the free of in credit process. So most people do not pay for their banking. And therefore it becomes less valued in some people's eyes, because it's something it's there, it's free. Everyone, it's I deserve it. So, but we're transitioning very slowly to more packaged accounts now. So some people will pay for their banking. So I think it's, again, giving people choice as to whether or not they want to do that. But come back to the original principles, because we had the free of in credit banking, most people actually, it takes, and we saw this again with our research, it took them a lot to actually even think about transferring, because they couldn't be bothered, because they're not getting, again, like for like, why would they? As long as something happens, if I need it or whatever. Primarily it was driven by bad customer service. So good customer service rates would see that people may want to go to them. But it took a lot. So I would give you two examples where banks had real issues with their back office systems. They actually did not lose as many accounts as we thought they would. So again, it comes back to, in the UK, it's very sedentary market. People do not want to transfer. However, because we put the account service system in, if they do want to transfer, and the rates and the trust that we're building in it actually has seen numbers start to, never going to go high, but they're actually starting to increase.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? It's just showing that, if customers have a bit more information and they have the options of choice as well, sometimes it's just having the options and knowing what else is out there. So even increasing that awareness would be so critical to some of this. And I guess it'd be interesting as well to speak about, we've spoken about payments technology and payments solutions, and, helping consumers be aware of how they can engage with their banking and, switch if they are unsatisfied with their current bank. Thinking about more broadly the payments landscape, if we were to talk about cash, can you imagine a future where there isn't cash, or cash isn't as prevalent as it is now? And what can you tell me about how important you feel cash currently is in at least the UK, or even more broadly, just globally?
It's a really challenging question. I think we need to absolutely work collectively together to address this. And the reason, and it's really important, because this isn't just a UK issue, it's actually worldwide, that this is actually becoming more of a question. And you've seen other countries that don't have such payment legacy systems as the UK, or complex legacy systems, actually do other products. But if I come fundamentally back to the process, the people that tend to use cash tend to be those that are less financially vulnerable. And that's a big statement. And I think at the cost of processing cash and the societal impacts of cash, that it's been proven that if you've got cash, you're more likely to be mugged or whatever. There's a risk of actually having cash. Then that has to actually be, we have to work together to find a solution that you do not leave a segment of society behind. I mean, I actually start to look at other elements to this. So I start to think about actually how many people have got accounts, because that actually comes back to, and in the UK, what we've got 15.2 million individuals who are either non-users or have limited users of the internet. And you've then got there's 1.2 million people that actually do not have bank accounts. Now that number fluctuates, you can look at different research, but if you think about 1 million people have actually not got bank accounts, and then you think about the reasons why that's happening. And the three primary reasons is that they are, and I said there, 15.2 million are kind of digitally excluded. They also have the issue about rural and remote populations. And then obviously there are older population who do not want to change. Why should they change? They've always done it this way. It works for them. So you need to understand and address some of those issues before you can actually start to think about, actually, should we be withdrawing cash or should we be doing something different? So, I mean, there is other research that says in the UK, we still have 2 million people, 1 million without a bank account, 2 million people are still reliant on cash. But the numbers are reducing significantly, particularly with COVID. We've seen a sharp increase of digital cards taken on board. So in my world, what I'm saying is, unless you start to address the fundamental issues of ensuring that those people have sufficient education and ability to have the information to make the right decisions for themselves, then I think that we will be heading into problems for a segment of society. So if you think about that from the UK perspective, I'm really pleased. Actually, it's something we did in the Cooperative Bank many, many years ago. We used to have what we called a handy bank system. So you actually could, within the co-op stores, go into a till and actually do your banking at the till whilst you were doing your shopping. So in the UK, what we've been doing recently is, and I've been working with them, is a company called One Banks. And then primarily started in Scotland. When I say working with them, I just know the people that are David Hensley and David Falcoman actually are working closely with One Bank's team. And the principle is that they are actually in places that people will be going to, like shopping centres, etc. And they will then be able to answer questions, not just for one bank, but also multiple banks. And they're using open banking principles in order for them to get the data. So this is a good use of new principles so that people can actually get some assistance on a face-to-face basis and actually start to still get access to cash if they want it in a cost-effective way. Because let's face it, a lot of the legacy banks, actually, why should they be made to keep banking services open if it's costing them money on a weekly basis? So, and it's key that the government are working with this. So yesterday it was actually announced there's a access to cash action group, and they announced yesterday that they're actually going to extend the use of shared bank hubs, like One Banks, which I talked about, but also they're putting them into post offices. So again, that helps with the post offices to keep their relevance in the new world. But the second thing they're doing is they're actually doing a rapid rollout of cashback without purchase. And this is now going to be expanded to thousands of smaller shops. I think this is kind of like a little bit of a sticky plaster over the issue, but because I do think we still need to work with those communities to understand how we can address the digital excluded issues, that's about education, but also those remote areas, to ensure that they have access to an internet that actually works, which I wouldn't be able to function on a day-to-day basis if I didn't have the ability to do that.
Yeah, digital inclusion, I guess thinking about access as well, it's something that, we were progressing on, and then with COVID, everything shifted a little bit with, some people being forced to use digital more than they would before, but then also some people really being more excluded than they should be, just based on the fact that branches were closing or it was harder to use cash, which is kind of an unintended, a consequence that occurred just based on inclusion having this whole new disruption.
Yeah. So one of the things I've been doing whilst, for the last 18 months is actually working with the Emerging Payments Association. And the Emerging Payments Association actually has a number of members that are mainstream banks, but also a lot of fintechs. So these are actually, these are EMIs, these are products that are actually available to people that actually can be tailored to different segments of society. So for example, I've worked with a lovely company that actually their product is aimed at migrants, so they still have additional people that come in, or people that are on cash basis. So for example, for crops, if they come along and they pick the crops, then they work for a particular company for a particular time. And so they actually offer an account that those people can actually get access to, because it's underpinned by the company in which they're working for. And they can have actually then access to a digital account. The company then has the ability to pay them in a regulated way, and they can actually then access through the banking system. So it works really, really well. That just gives you one example. There's other examples of products that are aimed at specific people that need additional help, in potentially short-term lending products. It's costly, but it's better than actually some of the other products that may be accessible by these people. But what people don't realize is there are a range of products out there. They don't have to go to the existing or the mainstream banks. They can actually, if they've got particular needs, like they may have been rejected from an account elsewhere, if they've got a need, then there are products that they can actually have access to, some of which build them points so that they can then go into more access to different services within those products. But none of this is really known out there, and nor is the differential between an FCA product and a product that's actually underpinned by the financial services. There are a range of products out there that people can access, and I think that's what we should be doing. Is we should be saying to people, you don't need to go down a particular route. There are actually different products that could be better for your needs.
I think that also speaks to the role of education. I think you mentioned that before as well when thinking about digital inclusion, and even getting people aware of CAS and different initiatives and products that are out there. And I know that you've done some work with the Money Charity as well. Could you tell us a little bit about the work that the Money Charity does, and also how kind of what you're enjoying about your work with that charity, and how this is something that can actually help customers manage money, and how education and guidance can really help to address some of these inclusion initiatives or objectives?
Yeah, so I'm an advocate for financial inclusion. I'm also an advocate for diversity, etc. So I am always trying to find a route to actually ensure that people are able to make an informed choice, whatever that informed choice needs to be about. So the Money Charity is it's a small charity based in the UK. It provides education and support. So it provides it in two ways. So firstly, it works with the schools. And I've got a 21-year-old son, and my son is so useless at budgeting. I can't, even though I've rammed it into him and said, this is what you should be thinking about. He just gets his university money and think, woohoo, I've got loads of money in my account. Let's go and spend it. Ooh, I need to pay some rent. So honestly, so in case of students, I do not believe that they get sufficient education within school to actually help them through that day-to-day life. to explain to them the difference between a credit card and a debit card, or the API, or, you know, you have to pay things back, making sure that how you budget on a day-to-day basis. So the Money Charity actually goes into the schools, and I've been on a couple of their workshops, and it's absolutely aimed at the target audience, because it's very much an interactive principle in which they actually get the students to think about what they are doing, rather than actually, they give them an example of buying a laptop, you know, different methods of actually buying that and the way that you'd have to repay it. And you can see light bulbs going on in the students' minds, because they're being explained to and educated in a way, worked with, to give them a platform on which they can then start to go away and think about it. So that's the first thing they do, is they capture students, say, before they leave school, to ensure that they've got the ability to budget themselves. Secondly, though, they work in the community. So they've, so particularly at this stage where we are, that is really relevant. So they go into companies, and they will work either with their staff or with other partners, and they will provide tailored workshops aimed at what particular aspects wants to be discussed. Like, it could be pensions or anything like that. But more prevalently, what it is around actually ensuring that people understand there are different options to them. So it's around financial well-being, and they talk to them on a daily basis and ask them, you know, what they could do, and give them advice as to where they can go if they are in issues, having problems at the time, and especially important as we're coming out of the COVID regime.
It's a good approach to be thinking about kind of the new generation of people who will be, you know, getting into debt, utilizing credit, and making sure that they're aware of kind of how to manage this debt, and also where they can avoid it. Because I think sometimes a lot of the stories you hear of, you know, people who are in their 20s and get caught with debt, it's not intentional. It's just, you know, I utilized debt because I had, you know, I built up some debt because I had a credit card. I didn't pay with it for a specific reason. It was just there. And I think it's kind of helping to break that down and help people understand the longer term implications can be quite helpful. Even just contextualizing it and saying, you know, you want to buy a laptop, here are your 5 options. Which one do you think is going to be the best one in both the short term and the long term?
And the implications, you've said it there, Anna, you know, this is just about really educating, asking them to think before they sign something, and really explaining to them the ramifications of what they are doing. And I think it sounds simple, but it's really important that they're able to do that before they spiral into a world that's maybe uncontrollable. So that's what the Money Charity do, is really very much aimed at education, providing people and with the tools in which to make their own choices, and a platform, and also providing them with the information should they need help, where to go to. Because there are a plethora of organisations available around, and sometimes it's good to just get that little bit of clarity as to where to go forward.
Absolutely. And I guess to finish up, you mentioned that you're a diversity advocate, and you know you've worn many hats in your career. You've done charity, financial services, payments, regulation. You know, there's been a lot of work that you've done in different sectors. I'd love to know if there's any maybe advice that you have for, especially for women who are starting out their careers, and as someone who has, you know, worked in you know, and learnt a lot across different businesses. Is there any advice that you have for women starting their careers?
I mean, I wish I'd have had my own advice when I started off. I keep talking about my 15-year-old self, but when I started out at work, I mean, it's confidence. And also, I mean, for me, it would be actually don't accept the norm in a way, because if I look back, the only reason I progressed my career is because other people did it for me, because I didn't have the confidence in order to do so. So I explained I jumped from the co-op to BACS really because my boss at the time was saying, Anne, you need to get out there. And I know that a lot of younger people now have more confidence, but it's actually really recognizing how you can add value to the organization that you want to, and to recognize the value in yourself. So if there's anything, it's about confidence. Can I also, so diversity is absolutely my thing. And I have a lovely story around this, because when I left Bax, I really wanted, because it had been such a big time of my life, I really wanted to actually come out of that and make a break in a way. So as you do, I went to Uganda to work with some South Sudanese business people, because they're refugees within Uganda. I hadn't realized that when you talk about a refugee camp in Uganda, you're talking about 150 to 200,000 people. So it's not a small event. It's more like like the size of Wales or whatever. So I went to go to Uganda, and we worked with some lovely people and lovely women as well as men, which really surprised me. So these are people that have come from their countries, many of which had nothing. So there was a lovely lady called Florence, who we met, who came that just had some noodle and bread. And she sat at the roadside and she offered to mend people's clothes. And then she progressed and she got her own sewing machine. And when the time we met her, she was employing about 3 people. So you're talking about, so she was feeding between 20 to 30 people. So if you think about that, Jessica. Now, we had a great debate, and where I'm going with this is about how would you employ people, because in those communities, you tend to go by word of mouth, family, friends. May not be the best person, but they go to family, friends. Anyway, big arguments ensue, because we suddenly realised we were getting an unconscious bias. And, so it's very much, so the men were saying, oh, yes, we want someone with a financial education certificate. And the women go, we've never had the opportunity to get that. So you would never, ever employ us. And so I came away from that thinking to myself, actually, we have unconscious bias on a day-to-day basis in the UK. So if I was thinking about myself again, I would recognise that people that are talking to me may want to speak to me in their own language and see me, replace it. But I would always want to be, and I'd always advocate being yourself. And if you recognise conscious bias, just address it in a way that they're not doing it consciously. It's something that you just need to say, okay, I recognise that you may want to have a MAU of 40 or whatever, but I can do as good a job as them. I've got the skills and I can do that.
Such a good point. And I think it's a constant adjustment in our minds, where you have a thought and you think, where did that thought come from? That's my first thought, but how can I correct that? And it's just this constant growth where you're, just challenging the way that you think about things and interactions that you have, and how you're speaking to people and thinking about different circumstances, which I think comes down to a lot of the dialogue and conversation around inclusion as well, where it's not just thinking about the inclusion in the world that I'm in, but what about for people who had a different upbringing, or who have a different culture, or they were taught different things, different values. It's quite a complex topic, but I think it's the idea of just constantly keeping that in the back of your mind and recognizing that it's not conscious. You're not doing it on purpose, but it's just there, and it's something you just have to really be conscious of your unconscious bias, but just keeping it always in your mind.
Yeah, absolutely. And let me give you another story. So I came back and I realized that throughout my career I'd been doing it as well. So if I look back as to who I was employing, and I really was mortified. However, as you grow older, you as long as you recognize that people aren't doing this deliberately in most cases, but you kind of just make sure that you are able to put your case over as best as you can.
Definitely, because I think I've read some stats around people are more drawn to applicants for a role who remind them of themselves, because it feels familiar, you kind of know what you're dealing with. And it's even, especially in recruitment, it's a big one, because you just got to be thinking, hang on, what am I actually looking for, rather than who am I personally drawn to, or who do I feel is relatable because I'm imposing what I like in a person. So it's not an easy area.
And then the other thing I would do, the only other piece of advice I'll leave you with, and it's something that I wish I'd have done earlier, is always think, I mean, throughout my career, I've always been so busy doing what I've done at that time, really, okay, I was best work, I was doing many hours. You've got to think about tomorrow as well. And more importantly, as you're getting towards the middle of your career or the end of your career, just think about, actually, what do I want to do? So in my case, I didn't probably engage or create a network as much as I should have done, because I was too busy actually looking at my own, what I was doing on a day-to-day. I didn't go outside of the community in which I was working. I think it's always important to keep your ideas fresh, and also thinking about what you want to do tomorrow, i.e. a non-exec role or a trustee role, to actually look at your network and expand your network. And it's not about the old school network, jobs for the boys, but this is actually, realistically, if you nurture your network, then actually your network will nurture you. It will give you opportunities for the future.
And I think that's also what I enjoy so much about these conversations, because there's so much to learn from so many other people. And I think that you can get kind of caught up in your own headspace, but to actually just sit down and learn from people who have gone through all these challenges and learnt all these lessons through hard work, it's really inspiring. And I think there's been a lot that we've discussed today that I've been taking some notes, and it's really interesting to hear about your career and all the lessons, and also some of the decisions you've been part of. There's some pretty big milestones that are quite, they're quite impactful in the lives of UK consumers. So I think there's a lot of amazing achievements there. So I think to wrap up, it'd be good to know, for any of our listeners who would like to find out a bit more about your work or connect with you, where's the best place for them to look?
The only place I'm on is actually on LinkedIn. That's me doing my network too well. But you can get me on LinkedIn.
Perfect. Well, thanks so much, Anne, for your time. It's been a pleasure speaking to you, and I'm sure our listeners are going to really enjoy this episode.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Global Digital Banker podcast. You can find us on iTunes, Spotify, and Podbean.